The wind outside Clermont has teeth. It bites through wool, through leather, through the pride of men who like to believe they cannot be shaken. And yet, on this morning in late November, the field is crowded, so crowded that the cold can't keep people away. They came expecting a church council, a gathering of bishops and nobles, arguments over discipline, over reform, over who has the right to command whom in a world where crowns and mitres constantly collide. They came for the usual business of medieval power. But then the Pope steps onto a simple wooden platform, and something changes in the air. Urban II doesn't look like a warlord. He looks like a man who has carried too many burdens in silence and decided, finally, to set one down in public. He surveys the crowd, clergy in heavy robes, knights in travel-stained mail, lords with banners folded behind them, and ordinary villagers who have never been this close to a pontiff in their lives. And he does something deliberate, something that tells you he wants more than polite agreement. He speaks so people can understand him. Not the Latin of scholars and chancery seals, the living tongue of the roads and marketplaces, the language of mothers and soldiers, of boys who dream of becoming men, and men who worry they have already failed God. He speaks plainly because this is not meant to stay inside cathedral walls. This is meant to travel. Urban begins with fear, because fear is a spark. He tells them the Christian world is threatened. He tells them that the lands of the East are suffering, that the faithful there are calling out for help. He paints a picture of churches under pressure, of travelers harassed on old pilgrimage routes, of sacred places no longer secure. Most of the people listening have never seen Jerusalem. Many couldn't point to it on a map, and yet the name lands with weight, like a bell struck in the heart. Jerusalem isn't only a city to them, it's a story. Its memory and meaning stacked together until it becomes almost more real than their own villages. And then Urban does the thing that turns a sermon into a movement. He offers not just a cause, but a bargain of the soul. He tells them that if they go, not for gold, not for status, but for devotion, this journey can stand in place of penance, that sins can be remitted through the act of taking the cross, through hardship accepted for the sake of God, through the vow itself. To modern ears, it might sound like rhetoric, but to this crowd, living in a world where sin is heavy and salvation feels distant, it is like a door opening. You can almost feel the thought moving through the field. What if my life, with all its failures and compromises, can still be turned towards something holy? What if the weight I've been carrying has a path out of me? A murmur begins, then grows, then breaks into something louder, something with rhythm and heat. Men reach for their tunics and tear strips of cloth, crude and urgent, to form crosses. Some do it with trembling hands, like they're afraid the moment will pass if they don't seize it. Some do it with the confidence of men who have wanted permission to fight for years. And then the cry rises, God wills it. Maybe Urban speaks it. Maybe the crowd finds it on its own. The truth is, once a crowd believes a moment is sacred, it becomes difficult to separate the speaker from the echo. Either way, the phrase catches like fire. But here's the part most people miss when they picture Clermont as a single flash of inspiration. Urban isn't improvising. This is not an accident. He has prepared for this. He has traveled, negotiated, built alliances, and waited for the right wind. Because Urban isn't only a preacher, he's a strategist. For decades, the Latin Church has been locked in a struggle over authority. Popes against emperors, bishops against lords, reformers against entrenched power. Europe's knightly class is violent and restless, constantly at war with itself. Urban sees a way to redirect that energy, not simply to stop bloodshed at home, but to unify Latin Christendom under a cause that places the papacy at the center. A war that looks like a pilgrimage that carries the force of a war. And there is another ingredient Urban is holding, carefully, like a coal wrapped in cloth, a plea from the East. Because far from Clermont, across mountains and seas, another world is fraying. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantine, still shines in mosaics and domes, still prays in incense and gold. But behind the beauty, the structure has cracked. After the death of Basil II, the empire's great warrior emperor, the imperial machine begins to weaken. The professional army that once guarded Asia Minor loses its strength through neglect and court politics. Aristocratic families compete for influence in Constantinople, pulling at the state like rival hands on the same rope. And as the rope frays, a new power rides in from the steppe. Turkish horsemen, Seljuk Turks. To the people in Clermont, Turks is a distant word, half rumor, half nightmare. But in the East, it is a reality with dust on its boots and arrows in its quivers. The Seljuks have moved fast, not as a single unstoppable tide, but as a force that exploits weakness. They raid, they settle, they seize opportunities. They push into the empire's heartland, Anatolia, where farmland feeds the cities and recruits fill the ranks. This is the background Urban is drawing from when he speaks of an embattled faith. Even if he sharpens the edges to convince his audience, the underlying truth remains. The eastern frontier is failing, and the consequences will not stay in the east. So when the crowd at Clermont answers him, they are not responding only to piety. They are responding to a world that feels unstable in ways they can't fully name. They are responding to guilt and hope and fear of the end times. They are responding to the promise of meaning. They are responding to the idea that God has placed a choice in front of them and that refusing it might be a sin in itself. Within weeks, the sermon becomes a rumor. The rumor becomes a plan. The plan becomes movement. Letters go out. Preachers repeat the call in towns and villages. Lords argue over who will go and who will stay, who can afford it, who can't. People sell land, they mortgage estates, they barter heirlooms, not for the same reason, some for devotion, some for glory, some to escape debt or disgrace, but they wrap their reasons in the same symbol, the cross. And the most astonishing detail is this: Urban has no standing army, no vast treasury to pay soldiers across a continent. What he has is an idea strong enough to recruit its own body. An idea with a spine of theology and a face of urgency. An idea that makes ordinary people believe they are stepping into sacred history. But even as this new force begins to form, it already contains a shadow. Because the Pope can ignite a movement, but he cannot fully control what it becomes. Once the road is opened, anyone can step onto it, trained knights and desperate peasants alike. Some will interpret the call as discipline, others will interpret it as permission. And as the movement swells, the East waits. In Constantinople, the emperor who sent the plea, who wanted a limited number of seasoned fighters, will soon see the scale of what's coming. He will realize the West has answered with a tool, but with a storm. And behind all of this, behind Clermont, behind the banners, behind the vows, there is a deeper truth that makes this moment more than a religious rally. The road to Jerusalem doesn't begin as a straight line. It begins as a crack. A crack in an empire that once believed it would last forever. A crack widened by rival families, by weakened armies, by new powers on old frontiers. A crack that turns a regional crisis into a continental idea. And if you want to understand why thousands will soon leave their homes, cross rivers and mountains, and walk into the unknown, you have to remember this. Clermont is the spark, yes, but the firewood was already stacked. Somewhere far to the east, decades before Urban's words, a battlefield has already sent an echo forward in time. An echo of imperial failure, of broken lines, of a world tilting. And now in this windswept field, that echo finds its answer. Not in a treaty, not in a single army, but in a vow spoken aloud by an entire civilization. One that believes, in this moment, that history has called its name.
By the time you meet Romanos Diogenes, the Byzantine Empire is still dressed like an emperor, but it no longer breathes like one. From a distance, Constantinople gleams. Domes catch the light. Mosaics throw back gold. The court speaks in polished phrases and ancient titles. Yet underneath, the empire is tired in the way an old tree is tired. It still stands, but the core has begun to soften. People in the capital still talk about Basil II as if he were a legend you can borrow strength from. Basil died in the early 11th century, and after him, the throne became a revolving door. Emperors came and went, some weak, some unlucky, many trapped inside the palace games they thought they controlled. The professional army that once anchored Byzantine power was slowly hollowed out. Less pay, fewer trained men, more reliance on politics, favors, and short-term fixes. Great families rose, not as servants of the state, but as owners of it, tugging the empire in different directions. Romanos enters this world like a man stepping into armor that doesn't fit. He is a soldier emperor in a court that has learned to fear soldier emperors. He brings the smell of campaigns into rooms that prefer incense. He speaks with the bluntness of a commander to people who survive by speaking around the truth. And he knows from the beginning that he has enemies. Not enemies on the frontier, those are expected. He means enemies within the city, within the corridors, within the polite smiles. Byzantium does not only fight with spears and cavalry, it fights with marriages, titles, accusations, and the silent turning of alliances. Romanos can feel that turning. Because while the court argues over prestige, the border is changing shape. To the east, across Anatolia, a new power is moving. fast, flexible, and hungry. The Seljuk Turks, steppe-born and newly dominant, have pushed into the Byzantine world not like a single wall of soldiers, but like weather. They appear, vanish, reappear. They raid, they probe, they test weak points, and where the empire's defenses are thin, they do not merely pass through, they stay. Camps become settlements, settlements become control. Anatolia matters more than most people in Constantinople want to admit. It's not just territory, it's food, it's tax, it's recruitment, it's the deep foundation beneath the capital's marble floors. Lose Anatolia, and the empire doesn't just shrink, it starts to starve. Romanos sees that clearly. He does not have the luxury of elegant delay. So he decides to do the one thing a soldier emperor is expected to do: march east, find the problem, and force an answer. This is where the story takes on the feel of a drumbeat. Orders go out, men gather, horses are shod, wagons creak under grain and gear. In camp, you hear the small sounds that precede history: a strap tightening, a blade being whetted, a priest murmuring prayers in a low voice that tries to sound calm. Romanos walks among his soldiers the way a commander does when he wants them to see him, not as a distant symbol, but as a living center. He looks into faces. He reads posture, fatigue, confidence, fear. He knows morale is a weapon as real as any sword. But he also reads something else, something colder. He reads loyalty, and what he finds is not comforting. Many of the men around him, generals, nobles, high officers, are tied to factions back in Constantinople. They are not a single body. They are a collection of bodies sharing a road, each with a private map of ambition. The most dangerous thing on a campaign is not always the enemy ahead. Sometimes it is the doubt behind. Among those shadows, one family stands out: the Ducai, powerful, entrenched, expert at surviving. And close to the center of that network is a man whose name will cling to this story like a thorn: Andronicus Ducas. At this stage, Andronicus doesn't need to shout, he doesn't need to threaten. His influence is quieter than that. It lives in sideways glances and conversations that stop when the emperor enters the tent. It lives in the knowledge that if Romanos fails, others are ready to step forward and declare the failure inevitable. Romanos understands the implication. Every mile east is also a mile away from the court that can replace him. Still, he presses on, because the alternative is worse. If he does nothing, Anatolia continues to slip. If Anatolia slips, the throne becomes an ornament, and Romanos did not take the crown to become an ornament. He sets his sights on the region around Manzikert, near Lake Von, fortress country, strategic, symbolic, the kind of place that says to friend and foe alike, here is the line. In later generations, people will tell stories about this march. They will add omens. They will sharpen the sky into a prophecy. You can understand why. When an empire stands at an edge, people want the edge to feel meaningful. They want the heavens to react. So they say that on the night before the great clash, something dark crossed the camp. Perhaps a bird, perhaps a shadow, something that made men fall quiet for a heartbeat. Soldiers are practical, but they are also human. A tired man in armor can become superstitious with almost no effort. Romanos, for his part, does not have time to be carried away by signs. If he believes in omens, he does not show it. He is the kind of man who treats the future like a problem to be solved by preparation. He gathers his commanders. He listens. He weighs incomplete reports. Intelligence is messy, especially on a frontier where scouts can ride into empty land and return with certainty that dissolves the next morning. The Seljuks don't fight like the empire fights. They do not always offer a clean battle. They move, they mislead, they let you see what they want you to see. Romanos tries to impose order anyway. He makes decisions, some necessary, some risky. He divides forces for practical reasons, to cover ground, to secure positions, to avoid being blind in a landscape designed to swallow armies. In theory, it's sound. In practice, division is dangerous when trust is brittle. Because division creates gaps, and gaps invite exploitation, not only by an enemy in the field, but by rivals who might prefer the emperor weakened. This is the moment where the campaign begins to feel like it has two battlefields. One battlefield is out there, on the dry plains and ridges where Seljuk riders watch from a distance and wait for the right hour. The other battlefield is inside the Byzantine camp itself, inside the hierarchy, inside the competing loyalties, inside Andronicus's silence, inside the whispered calculations of men who ask themselves, if the emperor breaks here, where will I stand when we return? Romanos knows all of that, and still he moves forward, because he believes there is a narrow corridor to victory. Force the Seljuks into a decisive engagement, reassert control, restore confidence in the army, and return to Constantinople not as a vulnerable ruler, but as a conquering emperor. That is the dream, and it is not foolish. Empires have been saved by a single campaign before, but the dream has a flaw. It assumes the empire will stand behind the emperor once he wins, and Romanos cannot be sure of that. So in the days before Manzikert, you see him doing two things at once. He is preparing to confront a foreign enemy, and he is guarding himself against a domestic one. He listens carefully to every report. He watches who speaks up and who stays silent. He notices who volunteers for danger and who chooses positions that carry influence without risk. He is trying to hold the campaign together more than orders. He is trying to hold it together with sheer will. When the sun rises on the approach to Manzikert, the empire feels both enormous and fragile. Standards lift in the wind. Priests bless men who pretend not to be afraid. Armor creaks as soldiers mount and dismount. Horses snort, sensing tension through the hands that hold their reins. And somewhere beyond the visible ridgeline, the Seljuk world is also moving, swift, disciplined, confident that Byzantium's weight can be turned into a weakness. Romanos rides at the center, not because he craves spectacle, but because he understands symbolism. A Byzantine emperor belongs at the heart of his army. If the heart is hidden, the body begins to doubt. He looks east, towards the fortress and the open country beyond it, and he looks inward, towards the people who ride close enough to protect him or to abandon him. The irony of Romanos's position is that he is trying to save an empire that no longer knows how to be saved. The machinery is damaged, the gears grind, the parts do not always obey the hand that should control them. Still, Romanos tightens his grip on the reins and commits to the only path a soldier can respect: forward. Because at this edge of the world, hesitation is not neutral. Hesitation is surrender with a polite face. And as the army advances towards Manzikert, the last thing you see, before the storm truly breaks, is the tension stretched between two truths. The empire needs Romanos to win.
Manzikert is not the kind of place that forgives mistakes. It's wide, dry country, where distances lie to your eyes, and a small gap in a line can become an open door. It's also the kind of landscape where an army doesn't just fight an enemy in front of it, it fights fatigue, uncertainty, and its own internal fractures. Romanos Diogenes arrives there in the summer of 1071 with a problem that has no easy shape. He needs a victory that's big enough to stabilize a frontier, but clean enough to stabilize the politics behind him. He needs to prove he can protect Anatolia, the empire's heartland, and he needs to prove it to men who are already imagining him failing. And right from the start, the campaign feels misaligned. Reports don't match. Scouts return with fragments. The Seljuks don't present themselves as a single solid target. They appear as movement, riders on the edge of sight, dust on the horizon, arrow shots that test reactions more than they seek a decisive blow. Romanos tries to impose the Byzantine preference for order on an enemy that thrives on disorder. At some point, whether from strategy, pressure, or incomplete intelligence, Romanos divides his forces. In theory, it's practical. Secure positions, cover ground, avoid being surprised. But a divided army is only safe if communication is flawless and loyalty is unquestioned. And neither of those things is fully true in Romanos' camp. The Seljuks, under Sultan Alp Arslan, sense this the way experienced hunters sense a change in the wind. They don't rush into the thickest part of the Byzantine formation. They orbit it. They tug at the edges. They invite the Byzantines to overextend, to chase shadows, to spend strength in the wrong direction. By late afternoon, the field has become confusing in a way that drains confidence. Romanos still has the center. His standards are still up. Commands still move through the ranks. But everything is harder than it should be, as if the army is wading through invisible water. And then comes the moment that later generations will argue about for centuries: the retreat. Here is what we can say with confidence. Romanos gives an order to pull back and reform, what a modern soldier might call a controlled withdrawal. It isn't by itself a sign of collapse. In battle, stepping back to tighten a line can be the smartest thing you do. But controlled retreats demand coordination. They demand that your rear and reserve understand the plan and move with you, not away from you. And this is where the story turns dark, and where one name starts to glow like hot iron: Andronikos Doukas. In the popular telling, the reserve under Andronikos does not support the emperor. In some versions, Andronikos withdraws at exactly the wrong moment. In others, he allows a rumor to spread that the emperor is dead or defeated. In still others, he deliberately chooses not to reinforce, because a weakened Romanos is a useful Romanos, or no Romanos at all. But when you step closer to the sources, you feel the fog around the truth. Medieval chroniclers had their loyalties, their grudges, their need to explain catastrophe in human terms. It is possible Andronikos acted out of calculation. It is also possible he acted out of fear, confusion, or a belief that the line was already breaking. History rarely gives you a single clean confession. What history does give you is the result. The Byzantine formation loses its spine. Once the center begins to pull back and the reserve does not move in harmony, the battlefield changes its rules. Commands become harder to hear. Units turn at different speeds. Men glance over their shoulders and see movement they don't understand. Confidence, the invisible armor that keeps people steady, starts to crack. The Seljuks feel it immediately. Their pressure increases. Their riders sweep in tighter arcs. Arrows come in waves, not just to injure, but to disrupt. The Byzantines, trained to hold a line, begin to find that the line is not where it was a minute ago. And suddenly, a retreat becomes a rout. You can picture it without turning it into spectacle. It's the sound of commands swallowed by noise. It's the way disciplined spacing collapses into clumps. It's the way an army's strength, its weight, becomes an obstacle when it needs to turn quickly. Romanos tries to halt it. He tries to reform. He rides where the pressure is worst because he understands what an emperor's presence can do for morale. But he's fighting physics now. Momentum, panic, the brutal speed of events once control is lost. By evening, the Byzantine army is fractured. Units scatter. The field belongs to the Seljuks. And Romanos is still there. This is the part of the story that matters, because it reveals the kind of man he is. Romanos does not vanish into the chaos. He does not slip away and blame his generals later. He stays with the core of his forces as long as he can. He is wounded. He is surrounded. And finally, he is taken alive. For an Eastern Roman emperor, capture is not just a military failure. It is an almost unthinkable humiliation, like a crown dropping into the dust in front of the whole world. And then something unexpected happens. Romanos is brought to Alp Arslan. You might expect cruelty. You might expect the kind of public degradation that makes legends. But the accounts, at least the ones that have endured, suggest something else. A meeting that is strangely human, strangely restrained. There's a famous exchange preserved in later chronicles. Alp Arslan asks Romanos, in effect, "What would you do if our roles were reversed?" Romanos answers honestly, too honestly for polite diplomacy, saying he might have him executed. Alp Arslan, according to the story, laughs and replies that he will not do the same. Is every word of that dialogue verbatim? Almost certainly not. Medieval writers love the sharp line. They shaped scenes into moral lessons. But even if the phrasing has been polished by retelling, the spirit of the moment fits what we know about power on that frontier. Pragmatism can be stronger than cruelty. Alp Arslan has just won a major victory. He doesn't need to prove himself with spectacle, and he has reasons to be careful. His own political world is complex. He has other rivals, other campaigns, other fires to put out. Keeping Romanos alive gives him leverage. It gives him options. So he chooses negotiation. And Romanos, sitting across from the man who has broken his army, does something that takes its own kind of courage. He negotiates too. The terms are harsh, but not theatrical. Territory will be conceded. Tribute will be paid. Hostages and promises are discussed. The goal is not to end all conflict forever. It's to turn a battlefield victory into a political advantage that can be managed. For a moment, it almost seems like this could be the end of the crisis. Romanos has lost, yes, but he is alive. He can return to Constantinople. He can say, "I paid a price, but I bought time." He can rebuild. He can stabilize the frontier before it collapses completely. And Alp Arslan releases him. Think about how rare that feels even in a brutal age. An emperor captured in the field, then allowed to walk out of the enemy camp with his life. It is the kind of moment where you can imagine Romanos believing the worst is behind him. Because he has survived the battlefield. He has survived the humiliation. He has even survived the enemy. But he has not yet faced the most dangerous enemy of all, the politics of his own capital. As Romanos begins the journey back west, the empire is already shifting without him. Courtiers are already telling stories. Rival families are already moving pieces on the board. In Constantinople, there are men who will not view his return as a second chance, but as a problem to be solved. And that's the final irony of Manzikert. The defeat is catastrophic, yes, but the catastrophe doesn't end with the battle. The battle is only the moment the door swings open. Beyond that door lies something worse than defeat in the field. A vacuum of authority. a fracture of loyalty, and a frontier that will not wait for the empire to recover its breath. Romanos rides towards home, carrying the weight of a fallen day, believing he can still make the empire whole. He does not yet know what Constantinople has decided in his absence. He does not yet know that the real punishment for losing Manzikert is not what happened under Alp Arslan's tent. It's what will happen under the roofs of his own people.
Andronicus Ducas leaves Manzikert without a victory song in his mouth. He leaves with something colder, the knowledge that a battlefield can end, but the consequences don't. And in Byzantium, consequences don't travel in a straight line. They travel through families, through whispers, through sealed letters that move faster than armies. If you were riding near him on that road back west, you wouldn't necessarily see a villain. You'd see a man wrapped in the heavy silence of calculation. A man who understands that in Constantinople, survival is an art and guilt is a luxury. Later generations will try to pin one clean word on Andronicus: traitor, coward, plotter, because it's easier to explain a disaster when you can point to a face. But stand closer to the moment, and what you feel is the pressure that shaped him. He belonged to the Ducai, a family with deep roots in the capital, a family that knew how quickly the throne could turn from a seat into a trap. And that's the first truth you need to hold on to as the empire reels. Byzantium didn't break at Manzikert only because the Seljuks were strong. It broke because its own bones were already thin. When Romanos Diogenes was taken in the field and then released by Alp Arslan, the story should have ended in a hard but manageable way. An emperor returns, bruised but alive, and he tries to rebuild. That's the version of the world Romanos probably wanted to believe in as he traveled back toward Constantinople. But Constantinople had been moving in his absence. In the capital, defeat was not treated like tragedy. It was treated like opportunity. The court didn't wait to see what Romanos would say. It began writing the next chapter without him. The Ducai, their allies, and other powerful figures understood something brutally simple. A captured emperor, even a released one, looked vulnerable. And vulnerability in Byzantium is an invitation. Romanos came home expecting to argue, to persuade, to bargain for time. He had faced an enemy across open ground and lived. He believed he could face the politics of his own city too. But the city didn't meet him with debate. It met him with replacement. A new emperor was raised in the Ducai circle, Michael VII. It wasn't simply a change of ruler. It was a message to every general, every governor, every ambitious noble. The old order is back in control. The soldier emperor has lost his claim, not just in the field, but in legitimacy. Romanos was arrested. And here, Byzantium reveals one of its darkest habits. It often preferred to unmake a rival in a way that was both symbolic and permanent. Romanos was blinded, because a blinded man could not rule. It was a punishment that didn't just end the reign, it erased it. It turned a former emperor into a warning. Romanos died soon after, in exile, his body giving up under the weight of what had been done to him. And if you listen closely to the empire at this moment, you can hear a shift. Not a single loud crack, more like the sound of an old building settling after a major beam is pulled out. Because whatever you think of Romanos, his fall created a void. And the empire paid for that void immediately. The defeat at Manzikert was already severe, but the true disaster was what came after. The empire's authority in Anatolia begins to dissolve. Without a stable, respected center, the frontier doesn't wait politely. The frontier moves. Turkish groups, Seljuk forces, and allied warbands push deeper into the interior. At first, it looks like raids. Then, it looks like encampments that don't leave. Then it looks like land changing hands. Villages empty. Roads become unsafe. Local magnates make their own deals to survive. Farmers flee westward, toward the Aegean coast and toward the safety of the capital's orbit. And every family that leaves is not just a human loss, it's a loss of tax, of recruits, of food, of the quiet labor that keeps an empire functioning. By the time you reach the early 1073s, large parts of central Anatolia are no longer effectively Byzantine. Fortresses that once anchored defense are isolated. Some fall, some surrender, some are simply abandoned because there is no relief coming. And while this happens, the empire is too busy fighting itself. Because the removal of Romanos doesn't bring unity, it invites more competition. Generals declare themselves emperors, factions rise and fall, court intrigues multiply. Every civil conflict costs money the treasury can't spare. Every internal struggle consumes soldiers who should be holding the frontier. And as the empire argues over the ground beneath the crown is being taken away. This is where Andronicus becomes something more than a man in a story.
He becomes a symbol of how Byzantium could undermine itself, not necessarily through one dramatic act, but through a pattern: personal loyalty over institutional loyalty, family over empire, immediate advantage over long-term survival. And yet, this matters. Andronicus also represents something very human. He represents the fear that if you bet on the wrong emperor, you might fall with him. In a system where politics could destroy you as completely as a sword could, many people didn't choose the righteous path. They chose the survivable one. If you're looking for a clean moral lesson, Byzantium refuses to give it to you. It offers instead a question: how does a state endure when its elites treat power like a private inheritance rather than a public trust? Now look west, across the sea, and you can begin to see why this matters beyond the empire itself. Because when Byzantium weakens, it creates space, and space in history is never empty for long. A new Turkish polity begins forming in former Byzantine lands. Over time, it will become the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, with its power center eventually at Nicaea, uncomfortably close to Constantinople. That single fact alone should make your stomach drop if you're standing in the imperial palace. Nicaea is not a distant border town, it's a warning on your doorstep. Meanwhile, Byzantium's other enemies notice the weakness too. In the west, Norman adventurers push into imperial territory. Along the northern frontiers, raiding pressures continue. And inside the capital, factions keep sharpening their knives because the emperor's chair has become less sacred than it used to be. So by the time you reach the early 1081s, the empire looks like a patient kept alive by habit rather than health. The treasury is strained, the army is fragmented, the legitimacy of government is compromised by the speed with which rulers are replaced. And this is the moment when a new figure steps forward, not as a miracle, but as a specialist in survival: Alexios Komnenos. Alexios doesn't rise because the world suddenly becomes kind. He rises because he's young enough to be ruthless, skilled enough to be effective, and connected enough to seize what others hesitate to take. He's a hardened general from a powerful family, trained in the brutal arithmetic of Byzantine politics. You either control the capital, or the capital controls you. When Alexios takes the throne, he inherits a state that is not simply weakened, it's overextended and internally divided. The empire's enemies are not lining up one at a time, they're arriving all at once. And the most dangerous enemy isn't even a single army, it's collapse. You can imagine Alexios looking at the map and realizing something Romanos realized too. Anatolia isn't a peripheral loss, it's the engine room. Without it, Constantinople becomes a jewel sitting on an empty box. So the story of Andronicus and Romanos doesn't end with a punishment in a palace. It ends with a changed world. A world in which Byzantium is no longer the unshakable center of the Eastern Mediterranean. A world in which Western powers will begin to look east and see opportunity. A world in which the emperor in Constantinople will eventually send a plea for help across the sea. Help that will not arrive in the form he expects. And that is the haunting legacy of this moment. Manzikert wasn't only a defeat. The fall of Romanos wasn't only a coup. And Andronicus wasn't only a name in a blame story. Together, they formed the hinge on which the next era turns. Because when an empire starts fighting itself more effectively than it fights its rivals, the door to history doesn't just open, it swings wide.
Alexios Komnenos doesn't inherit an empire so much as he inherits a ship taking on water from every seam. By the time he steps into power, Byzantium is still magnificent to look at. Constantinople still dazzles, its domes, its mosaics, its harbors full of sound and salt. But the brilliance is misleading. Beneath the gold, the state is strained. The army has been battered and scattered. The treasury is thin. The frontiers don't feel like frontiers anymore. They feel like open doors. And the most dangerous part is this: the empire is not facing one clean threat. It is facing many threats at once, and each one feeds the others. When Alexandros moves against the sitting emperor in the year 1081, it isn't a ceremonial moment, it's a seizure, a calculated strike in a capital where power changes hands the way a dagger changes owners, quickly, quietly, and with consequences that last for decades. He is young, but he isn't inexperienced. Alexandros is a soldier raised inside the hard logic of Byzantine survival. He has spent his early life putting down rebellions, navigating shifting loyalties, and fighting campaigns where victory depends as much on timing and intelligence as it does on courage. He knows how to read a room. He knows how to read a battlefield. And most importantly, he knows how to read the distance between what people say in public and what they plan in private. To secure his position, he leans on what Byzantium always leans on when the state is weak: family and alliances.
He binds himself to the powerful Duca circle through marriage, taking Irene Ducaina as his wife because in Constantinople, blood and marriage are often stronger than law. If you want the throne to stay under you, you don't only need soldiers, you need relatives in the right places, names that intimidate rivals, and a network that can hold when the ground shifts. But seizing the throne is the easy part. Holding it is where the real war begins. Because Alexandros looks outward and sees the empire surrounded. In the west, Norman forces are pressing hard. Robert Guiscard, an ambitious Norman leader whose name carries weight like a threat, moves against Byzantine holdings in the Balkans. And with him is his son, Bohemond, a young commander already gaining a reputation for boldness and skill. The Normans are not only raiders, they are builders of power. They want territory, titles, and permanence. They understand the empire is distracted, and they are quick to exploit distraction. To the north, nomadic groups like the Cumans put pressure on borders that are already thin. Raids can become disasters when your army is fragmented. A single incursion can ripple through trade routes and tax collection like a stone dropped into water. And to the east, the wound that never stops bleeding, Anatolia is slipping further away. After Manzikert and the civil chaos that followed, Turkish groups have moved deeper into the interior of Asia Minor. Some are connected to the wider Seljuk world. Some are semi-independent warlords. From Constantinople, it might look like scattered fires. From the ground, it feels like a changing climate. Roads become uncertain. Fortresses become isolated. Towns stop paying taxes to the emperor, not necessarily because they hate him, but because they can no longer reach him. And Alexandros understands something most people in the capital try not to face. Anatolia is not a distant province. It is the empire's lung. It feeds the cities, supplies soldiers, anchors the economy. Without it, the empire can still shine, but only as a shell. So Alexandros does what a competent Byzantine ruler does when the old systems fail. He improvises without apologizing. He reforms where he can. He rebuilds the army with whatever tools are available. He raises funds, squeezes resources, renegotiates obligations, and leans hard on his personal network to fill gaps that institutions can no longer fill. He appoints loyal Komnenoi and Ducai to key positions, not out of sentimentality, but because loyalty is a currency Byzantium cannot afford to be short on. He also practices a kind of diplomacy that feels almost ruthless in its realism. When he can't defeat an enemy outright, he buys time. When he can't buy time, he divides enemies against each other. When he can divide them, he chooses the moment to strike. It's not romantic, it's survival. And for a while, it works. Alexandros holds the line in the west. He maneuvers, negotiates, fights, retreats, advances, and keeps the capital from falling into someone else's hands. He keeps Byzantium alive. But keeping it alive is not the same thing as healing it, because Anatolia remains the unsolved problem, the great lost engine room. Alexandros tries the methods Byzantium has used before. He hires Western mercenaries, Frankish knights, Norman cavalrymen, warriors from across the Latin world who fight hard and ride even harder. Byzantine emperors have always been pragmatic about using outsiders. The Varangian Guard itself is proof of that. Foreign soldiers turned into loyal protectors. But hiring a few bands of Western fighters is not the same as reclaiming a heartland the empire has already begun to lose socially, economically, and militarily. The recruitment systems that once filled Byzantine ranks from Anatolian villages have collapsed. In many areas, the local population has fled or adapted to new rulers. The imperial administration that once made the frontier work is broken in places Alexandros cannot easily reach. And Alexandros knows another truth. Even if he gathers soldiers, he needs the right kind. He needs disciplined troops who can fight in difficult terrain, who can withstand cavalry tactics unlike many Byzantines are trained to counter at that moment, and who can operate within a coordinated plan. He needs not just bodies, he needs a tool. So he makes a decision that feels small in his mind, but will become enormous in history. In the year 1095, Alexandros sends envoys to the west, not to beg for a crusade, not to unleash a continent. What he wants is far more limited, far more controlled. He wants a manageable force, seasoned Western knights and soldiers, men who can serve as reinforcements, who can be guided, paid, and integrated into a Byzantine strategy of retaking key cities and stabilizing the frontier step by step. He knows the West has fighters. He knows Western heavy cavalry can be devastating if used correctly. And he knows that the papacy, for all its spiritual power, also sits at the center of influence that can mobilize men faster than kings can sometimes manage. So Alexandros aims his plea in a direction that makes strategic sense, towards Pope Urban II. It's a remarkable moment if you pause and really picture it. The Eastern Roman Emperor, heir of Caesar, ruler of Constantinople, reaching out to the Bishop of Rome for armed assistance. Not long before, relations between the Greek East and Latin West have been strained. The divide is theological, cultural, political. There are old wounds and fresh suspicions. The empire and the papacy do not naturally trust one another. And yet, necessity has a way of forcing hands. Alexandros isn't naive about this. He understands the risks. Western warriors are valuable, but they are also unpredictable. Some of them descend from the very Normans who have attacked Byzantium in living memory. Some might arrive with ambitions of their own. Some might see Byzantium's wealth and think of it as a prize rather than a partner. Still, Alexandros makes the call because his options are narrowing. In his mind, this is not a turning point for the entire medieval world. It's a calculated move in a desperate chess game. He is sending for reinforcements the way a commander sends for supplies. He expects bargaining. He expects negotiation. He expects to remain, ultimately, the director of events on his own soil. What Alexandros doesn't fully see, because no one could see it clearly from Constantinople, is how combustible the West has become. Europe at this time is packed with restless energy. Knights accustomed to local wars are looking for sanctioned purpose. The church is searching for ways to direct violence away from Christian against Christian. Ordinary people are hungry for meaning, for salvation that feels tangible, for a journey that turns suffering into redemption. Pope Urban is also looking for something. He is looking for a cause large enough to unite Latin Christendom, to reinforce papal authority, and to redirect the spiritual imagination of an entire society. So when Alexandros' envoys arrive with their plea, Urban does not see a modest request. He sees an opening. Alexandros imagines a controlled expedition. Urban imagines a holy movement. And that gap between what the emperor needs and what the pope can unleash will define everything. At the moment Alexandros sends his message, he likely believes he is pulling a lever inside a familiar Byzantine machine: diplomacy, mercenaries, logistics, and gradual reconquest. He doesn't yet realize he has tugged on a rope connected to something far larger, something that will come towards Constantinople not as a few thousand hired lances, but as tens of thousands of people convinced they are walking into sacred history. For now, though, Alexandros remains in the world he can still measure. He stands on walls and studies horizons. He listens to reports from Anatolia and the Balkans. He counts resources. He weighs alliances. He holds the empire together with sheer competence and the kind of patience that looks almost like coldness to those who don't understand what he's trying to prevent. Because Alexandros has learned a rule that Romanos learned too late.
By the time Pope Urban II appears on the stage of history, the papacy is no longer just a spiritual office. It's becoming a political force, one that's learning how to speak in the language of power without ever admitting that it's doing so. To understand Urban, you have to understand the West he inherits. For centuries, the popes of Rome struggled to control even their own city, let alone the rulers of Europe. Kings and emperors treated bishops like appointments they could hand out. Noble families in Rome treated the papacy like a prize to be fought over. And the so-called Vicar of Christ was often forced to negotiate for survival in the same way any local prince would. But the 11th century changes the temperature of everything. A wave of reform rises out of monastic life, especially the movement associated with Cluny. It's not just about stricter discipline or cleaner morals, although it certainly claims those. It's about independence. The reformers argue that the church should not be controlled by lay rulers, that spiritual authority shouldn't be bought, sold, or inherited like land. And at the center of this idea is something revolutionary for its time. The Pope should stand above earthly rulers, answerable only to God. That vision reaches its sharpest form under Pope Gregory VII. Gregory is not remembered for gentleness. He's remembered for confrontation. He clashes with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in what becomes known as the investiture controversy, the brutal argument over who has the right to appoint bishops and abbots. Gregory insists it belongs to the church. Henry insists it belongs to the crown. And because this is the Middle Ages, the argument isn't the debate in a hall. It becomes an open struggle for legitimacy. Gregory even excommunicates Henry, essentially declaring him cut off from the community of the faithful. In response, Henry pushes back with force, marching into Italy and backing a rival pope. Rome itself becomes a battleground for competing claims, competing banners, competing versions of the truth. Gregory dies in exile, but the idea he fought for survives. And that idea, papal supremacy, doesn't disappear with him. It becomes a weapon waiting for the right hand. That right hand, in many ways, is Urban II.
Urban is a product of the Reform movement, a former monk trained in the discipline and ambition of Cluniac ideals. When he becomes pope in the late 1080s, he steps into a world still torn by the aftershocks of Gregory's War. The church is not unified, Rome is not fully secure. A rival pope, Clement III, still holds influence with imperial backing. Urban's authority is real, but it's contested. So Urban does what a patient strategist does. He doesn't charge into the center and demand obedience, he builds it. He travels through France and Italy, gathering allies among bishops and nobles. He strengthens the reform message. He presents himself not merely as an administrator of sacraments, but as the head of a militant, purified church, one that can command, organize, and direct. And while he's doing that, he's also looking for a cause big enough to do something that reforms and decrees alone cannot do: unite the West under his leadership. Then, in the spring of 1095, an opportunity arrives from the east. Envoys come from Constantinople, from Emperor Alexios Komnenos, an emperor struggling to hold his empire together after decades of disaster and internal conflict. The Byzantine plea is, on its face, practical. Alexios wants professional fighters, a manageable number of skilled Western troops, men who can reinforce his campaigns in Anatolia, push back Turkish pressure, and help restore lost ground. It is not an invitation for a mass movement, but Alexios hears it differently. This is the moment when his patience meets possibility, when a local, political request becomes a lever that can lift the entire Western world. Urban meets the Byzantine envoys at the Council of Piacenza. The gathering is so large it spills outdoors. And there, in front of clergy and nobles, the envoys describe the suffering of Eastern Christians and the threat of Turkish power. They paint a picture of a frontier collapsing, of churches in danger, of a Christian world in the East calling out to its brothers in the West. Urban listens carefully. He understands what Alexios is asking, but he also understands what Alexios does not fully control: the hunger in the West for meaning, for unity, for a cause that feels larger than feuds between neighbors. Urban sees the chance to do multiple things at once. He can present himself as the protector of Christians everywhere, not only in the Latin West. He can redirect the violence of Europe's warrior class away from internal conflict and towards an external mission. He can strengthen his claim to lead Christendom, and perhaps even narrow the widening rift between Latin and Greek Christians, at least on the surface, at least for the duration of a common struggle. And he can do it without needing an army of his own. Because if there is one thing the papacy has learned by this point, it's this: authority is not only about soldiers, it's about making people believe that your command is also your salvation. Urban doesn't announce everything at Piacenza. He doesn't unleash the full storm yet. Instead, he begins to prepare. He lays foundations, quietly, methodically, like a builder measuring beams before raising the roof. By the time he reaches Clermont later that year, the stage is ready. Clermont is called as a council to address church matters, discipline among the clergy, reform, papal authority in the region. On paper, it's administrative, but Urban has something larger in mind. Over several days, he meets with influential figures, gathering support, reading the room, understanding which nobles might move, which bishops will echo him, and what language will strike the strongest chord. Then, on the final day, he steps outside and addresses a vast crowd gathered in an open field. Here's one of the most important details about Clermont. We don't have an official transcript. What we know comes from later accounts, chroniclers writing after the fact, shaping the sermon to fit their worldview. Some emphasize spiritual urgency, some emphasize stories of outrage and suffering, some want Urban to sound like a prophet, others want him to sound like a commander, so the exact words are debated. But the themes are clear. Urban describes the East as under threat. He speaks of Christians suffering. He speaks of sacred places, especially Jerusalem, as something that must not remain out of reach. And he urges Western warriors to stop fighting each other and take up a holy cause. This is where Urban's genius becomes obvious. He doesn't simply call for war, he reframes it. He connects it to pilgrimage, the most powerful spiritual practice of the age. For generations, men and women have traveled to holy sites as an act of devotion. Pilgrimage is hardship with meaning. It's suffering turned into a spiritual offering. Urban takes that familiar idea and fuses it with something far more dangerous: armed obligation. He presents the journey to the East as a form of penance, a sacred road, not a private act of devotion, but a collective mission with eternal consequences. And then he offers what makes the crowd tremble, what turns a concept into a vow. He promises remission of sins for those who go in devotion. Think about what that means to someone living in the 11th century. Penance is not a metaphor. Sin is not an abstract guilt. It is a weight that shapes daily life, social standing, and fear of judgment after death. People fast, pray, give alms, go on pilgrimage, all to ease that weight. Urban offers a single path that seems to compress all of it into one act. Take the cross, Go east, and your burden can be lifted. This isn't just theology, it's a psychological key. It opens something in the hearts of men who've spent their lives in violence and now hear that violence can be sanctified, if aimed in the right direction, under the church's blessing. It opens something in ordinary people who've lived small lives under hard conditions and suddenly feel invited into a story that reaches to the edge of the world. And it gives the papacy what it wants most, the power to mobilize not merely obedience, but passion. When the crowd responds, it doesn't respond like an audience at a council. It responds like a force being born. Men tear cloth and form crosses. Preachers begin repeating the call. Word spreads faster than anyone can fully contain. Urban has done something no pope before him had done at this scale. He has connected salvation to a public mission, and he has made that mission depend on papal authority. It's important to say this clearly. Urban likely imagines order. He imagines trained knights and organized lords moving under recognizable leaders, taking a defined route, arriving as a force that can actually achieve strategic goals. What he unleashes, however, will be far less predictable, because once an idea is strong enough to move thousands, it doesn't stay neatly inside the plan of the man who spoke it. Urban struck the match. The West, already dry with conflict, spiritual anxiety, and ambition, becomes the tinder. And now the fire is on its way east, towards an emperor who asks for a tool and is about to receive a storm.
Picture the scene, the way the people there would have felt it, not the way we see it in textbooks. It's late November in southern France, the kind of cold that creeps in through wool and makes breath visible in the air. Outside the town of Clermont, an open field has become a gathering place for an entire cross-section of medieval life. Bishops in heavy robes, nobles wrapped in fur, knights with travel-worn gear, and ordinary people who came because word spread that something important was happening. They didn't come for a revolution. They came for a council. For days there had been church business, discipline, reform, disputes that mattered to clergy and lords. But Urban II didn't travel all this way to speak only to bishops behind stone walls. He wanted the crowd. He wanted the open sky. He wanted the moment to belong to more than the educated few. And when he finally steps outside and addresses them, he does something strategic and deeply modern in its instincts. He speaks in a way they can actually understand. Not the Latin of official documents, not the language of cathedral administration. He speaks in the common tongue, so the message can land directly. No interpreter, no delay, no distance between the words and the heart. There's one detail historians always return to here. We don't have a single official transcript of what Urban said. What we have are later versions, written by chroniclers with their own agendas and their own dramatic flair. Some versions focus on the suffering of Eastern Christians. Some pour their energy into Jerusalem. Some exaggerate horrors to justify what followed. It's not that nothing happened. It's that the exact phrasing was reshaped by memory, and memory in the Middle Ages was often a weapon. But across the surviving accounts, the same core themes keep rising to the surface, like stones under shallow water. Urban describes a Christian East under pressure. He speaks of believers beyond the sea who are asking for help. He frames the situation as urgent and collective, an injury to the whole body of Christendom. He draws attention to Jerusalem, not as a political target, but as the emotional center of a shared faith. And then he turns the knife in a way that hits his audience where they live. He tells them to stop fighting each other. Because Western Europe at this time is full of private wars, feuds, raids, vendettas that bleed the countryside and feed the pride of the warrior class. Urban doesn't deny that these men know how to fight. He tells them their strength has been aimed in the wrong direction. He offers them a new direction, and importantly, a holy reason to accept it. He is not simply recruiting soldiers, he is reorganizing meaning. And that's the shift that changes everything. Urban presents this journey east not just as war, but as pilgrimage. Pilgrimage with armor, pilgrimage with banners, pilgrimage with hardship that counts as spiritual cleansing. Medieval people understood pilgrimage. They understood leaving home, suffering on the road, and arriving somewhere sacred changed by the journey itself. Urban takes that familiar spiritual structure and binds it to a mission of force. Then he offers the promise that makes the air and the field feel charged. Remission of sins. Not a vague blessing, not God will look kindly on you, a concrete spiritual guarantee, as it would have been understood then. Take the cross in devotion, and the journey itself becomes penance. The burden of sin can be lifted through the act of going. To a modern mind, this might sound like propaganda. To an 11th century mind, it sounds like rescue. People lived with constant awareness of judgment and salvation. Penance wasn't symbolic, it shaped the rhythm of life. Fear of the afterlife wasn't abstract, it was as real as hunger. Urban offers a way to convert fear into purpose. And once that door opens, the crowd begins to move before anyone gives them permission to move. You can imagine the sound of cloth tearing, men ripping strips from their tunics and tying them into makeshift crosses. The symbol isn't crafted or perfect, it's raw, immediate, like the moment itself. Some kneel, some weep, some stare as if they've been struck by a truth they didn't know they were waiting for. For knights, it is a chance to reshape a violent life into a holy one. For peasants, it is a chance to step out of the small circle of survival and into something vast. For the guilty, it sounds like cleansing.
For the ambitious, it sounds like a road that might lead to honor. And then the cry rises, God wills it. Maybe it starts with Urban, maybe it erupts from the crowd. The effect is the same, a slogan that turns into a heartbeat, a shared rhythm that makes individuals feel like a single body. In that moment, the field is no longer a crowd listening to a sermon, it's a force deciding it has a destiny. But here's what makes Clermont even more remarkable. Urban didn't walk into this unprepared. This wasn't simply a spontaneous outburst of medieval emotion. Urban had been laying groundwork for months. He had been traveling, building support, recruiting allies among bishops and nobles, preparing the church's messaging so that when the call came, it could spread like a spark through dry grass. He had no standing army, no continent-wide treasury, no ability to pay tens of thousands of men to march across the world. What he had was an idea strong enough to finance itself, through belief, through social pressure, through the hunger for salvation and significance. And he understood how to push the idea into motion. He didn't frame the crusade as a private project for knights alone, he made it universal. He cast the call wide, addressing not only lords but ordinary people, anyone willing to take the cross. That breadth was intentional. A movement that belongs to everyone becomes harder for any rival power to control or contain. Urban also understood the politics behind the religion. A common external mission could, at least temporarily, quiet internal conflicts. It could unify Latin Christendom around the papacy. It could make the Pope not simply a moral voice, but the architect of a continent-wide action. And it could, in theory, reconnect the Latin West to the Greek East, bridging a widening divide through a shared undertaking. In other words, Urban is lighting more than a spiritual candle. He's lighting a political beacon. And it works, almost too well. Because once the sermon leaves Clermont, it doesn't travel as a neat official plan. It travels as rumor, as retelling, as passionate distortion. Preachers repeat it in villages, priests echo it in town squares. Some repeat Urban's careful framing, others add their own heat, their own apocalyptic urgency, their own stories of visions and signs. And when ordinary people hear Jerusalem, they don't always hear organized expedition, they hear now. They don't imagine supply lines and seasons and coordination with the Byzantine emperor. They imagine a straight road from their village to heaven, and they believe the road begins the moment they step onto it. This is the point where Urban's success becomes the start of his loss of control, because he may have imagined disciplined nobles leading armies at the right time, but the first wave that forms is not made of princes. It is made of the poor. Men and women, peasants and craftsmen, families with children, minor knights with little wealth, all gathering around charismatic preachers who can give shape to their longing. The church can try to guide it, but the movement is already bigger than churchmen on horseback can manage. And the momentum is dangerous, because a mass of people convinced they are on a holy mission can become unpredictable. It can turn its frustration and hunger in the wrong direction. It can interpret enemies of God in ways Urban never officially intended. It can move like a flood, powerful, sincere, and destructive when it hits obstacles. Urban may have struck the spark at Clermont, but now the fire is running ahead of him. As the winter fades into spring, the roads begin to fill with people who are not waiting for noble leadership. They are not waiting for the proper departure. They are leaving now because they believe delay is disobedience. And somewhere far away in Constantinople, Emperor Alexios, who had asked for a limited force of professional fighters, has no idea what is about to arrive at his gates. He imagines mercenaries he can hire, coordinate, and deploy. He does not yet imagine tens of thousands of pilgrims moving east like a storm. So when you think back to Clermont, hold both truths in your mind at once. It is a sacred moment for many who heard it, a genuine eruption of devotion, fear, hope, and longing for redemption. And it is also a calculated moment, an act of leadership that turns theology into mobilization, and mobilization into history. In that windswept field, Urban doesn't merely ask for help for the East, he creates a new category of person, the crusader, the armed pilgrim, the warrior whose journey is framed to salvation. And once that person exists, once thousands believe they have become that person, the road east can no longer be closed. Not by emperors, not by bishops, not even the Pope who opened it. The first wave is already moving, and the empire on the other side of the sea is about to learn what it means when the West answers a request, with a force it cannot control.
In the summer of 1096, Constantinople began to see something it had no proper name for. Not an embassy, not a hired company of knights, not a neat column of soldiers under clear command. What appeared on the roads leading to the capital looked more like a moving weather front. People in rough clothing, carts and bundles, a few horses, many feet, and a kind of burning certainty that made them ignore every warning sign along the way. From the top of the city walls, it must have felt unreal. Theodosian stone beneath your boots, the domes and markets behind you, the sea glittering in the distance, and out there, beyond the gates, a swelling mass of pilgrims pressing closer day by day. This was the answer to a letter Emperor Alexios had sent west, only it wasn't the answer he meant. Alexios had asked for something limited and practical, a manageable force of trained fighters, men who could be supplied, directed, and folded into a strategy for recovering the empire's lost land in Anatolia. What he received first was a crowd, tens of thousands of ordinary people, driven by sermons and rumor, convinced they were walking towards salvation itself. Inside Constantinople, the problem wasn't theological, it was immediate and physical. How do you feed that many mouths? How do you keep order when people arrive exhausted, hungry, and convinced that every hardship is proof they're on the right road? How do you prevent a city already stretched by war and politics from becoming a pressure cooker? Alexios was not a man who panicked easily, But he was a strategist, and strategists see crises before they become disasters. He looked at the arriving masses and understood something in an instant. This was not an army. This was a moving emergency. The People's Crusade, as later generations would call it, had a heartbeat, not a chain of command. It had devotion, not logistics. There were a few minor nobles among them, small bands of mounted men, but most carried whatever they could, a staff, a knife, a worn tool that could pass for a weapon if you squinted. Families traveled together, children walked beside carts, elderly men leaned on sticks and kept going because stopping felt like failure. And at the center of the movement, at least in its most famous version, was a figure who seemed cut from the cloth of medieval imagination, Peter the Hermit. People remembered him as a gaunt preacher in simple robes, riding a donkey, eyes bright with conviction. Whether every story about Peter was true hardly mattered. In a world that prized signs and sacred purpose, Peter looked like proof that God had spoken. When he preached, people believed their lives could become part of something eternal. Alexios had no desire to test how long that conviction would remain peaceful once hunger sharpened it. So he did what he always did when faced with a threat he could not absorb. He redirected it. He received the pilgrims with a kind of controlled hospitality, enough food to prevent immediate chaos, enough guidance to move them along, enough firmness to keep them out of the delicate heart of the city. And then he pushed them toward the Bosphorus. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. If the crowd stayed, Constantinople risked unrest, violence, even epidemic. If it crossed into Asia Minor, it was no longer inside the walls. It became a problem of distance. Alexios arranged ships. He urged the pilgrims to wait, to regroup, to coordinate with the larger Western forces that he assumed were coming behind them. He sent warnings through interpreters. The land across the strait was not empty. It was contested. It was dangerous. It was not a stage for miracles. But warnings don't travel far in a mind that believes destiny is on a schedule. The people wanted to move. They had taken the cross. They had already left home. Turning back felt unthinkable. Waiting felt like doubt, and doubt in their eyes was the first step towards spiritual failure. So they crossed. You can imagine the moment, the sea wind on their faces, the city's great walls receding behind them, and the sense that the world was opening. For many, it must have felt like stepping out of ordinary life and into scripture. And then Anatolia greeted them with reality. This wasn't a land that waited politely for travelers. It was a frontier filled with fast-moving forces who understood terrain, supply, and timing. The Seljuk power in the region was not a single rigid block, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to be smarter than a crowd. Once on the Asian side, the People's Crusade began to do what desperate, hungry masses often do. It broke apart. Groups peeled away from the main body to search for food, to raid farms, to seize what they believed they needed to survive. And every time the crowd fractured, it lost the only thing that might have protected it, its size. Byzantine guides tried to restrain them. Some leaders begged for discipline. But discipline is hard to maintain when the movement is built on emotion rather than organization. They drifted toward Nicaea, the Seljuk-held city that sat like a locked door on the road inward. Some pilgrims looked at it and imagined a prize. They thought, after everything they had endured, surely God would grant them an early victory. That belief, more than any weapon, led them into trouble. Seljuk forces under Kilij Arslan, the ruler in the region, did not need to meet the pilgrims in a heroic clash. They simply needed to let impatience do its work. Let small groups wander. Let the crusaders push forward without scouts, without supply lines, without coordination, then strike when the moment was right. Near a place remembered as Civito in October of 1096, the trap closed. Accounts from the time describe confusion, fear, and sudden collapse. The pilgrims were outmaneuvered, outmatched, and unprepared for a coordinated attack by forces that knew exactly how to exploit disorder. What had looked like a holy march turned into a desperate scramble for survival. Many did not make it back. Those who survived carried the same expression you see after a storm has torn through a village: disbelief, exhaustion, and the hollow shock of people who have discovered that conviction doesn't stop arrows and that God's will doesn't always look the way you expected. A handful of survivors managed to reach the coast and find safety, and among those who returned to Constantinople was Peter the Hermit. If you want a single image to hold from this chapter, make it this: Peter, the man who had once moved crowds with words, standing again within sight of the imperial city, but not as a prophet arriving in triumph, as a witness arriving with ruin behind him. Alexios received him, and if the emperor felt satisfaction, he didn't show it. Alexios was too disciplined for that, and too aware of what this meant. The People's Crusade had not weakened the Seljuks, it had not reclaimed a single strategic point, and it had not brought the kind of military help Alexios needed. It had only proven how volatile the situation had become. Because here was the deeper danger. The West had been set in motion, and it was moving in waves. The first wave had already crashed and broken, but waves don't stop because the first one failed. They keep coming. Alexios could not pretend this was finished. He could only prepare for what he knew was approaching. The princes. Unlike the pilgrims, the Western lords would not arrive empty-handed. They would bring armored knights, trained infantry, money, ambition, and their own ideas of what the crusade meant. They would come not as a crowd, but as several armies, each loyal to a different leader, each carrying its own politics across the sea. For Alexios, that was both hope and hazard. Hope because finally he might get what he asked for, real military muscle. Hazard because thousands of armed foreigners camped outside Constantinople was a problem of its own, especially when some of them descended from Normans who had attacked Byzantine lands in living memory. So the emperor stood at the threshold of a new kind of conflict. Not a simple war of Byzantines against Turks, but a complicated entanglement, east and west, ally and rival, faith and ambition, all compressed into one narrow corridor of geography, Constantinople's gates, the Bosphorus crossing, and the long road into Anatolia. The People's Crusade had a tragic failure, a demonstration that the crusade was not automatically a disciplined instrument in anyone's hand, not even the popes, and certainly not the emperors. And yet, for all its failure, it accomplished one thing that mattered more than any battlefield result. It proved that the call from Clermont had reached the deepest layers of society. It had reached people who owned nothing, people who had little to lose, people who could be moved not by politics, but by the promise of meaning. That kind of fire does not go out easily. It only changes shape. So, as Peter faded back into the background, alive, humbled, and still carrying his strange authority, Alexios turned his attention toward the western horizon, not because he trusted what was coming, but because he had no choice. The pilgrims had been swept away. Now the real armies were on the move, and soon the emperor who asked for a few thousand fighters would face something the medieval world had rarely seen, a vast coalition of princes marching under the sign of the cross, arriving at Constantinople like fate at the city gate.
By the time the next wave reached Constantinople, Alexios Komnenos already knew one thing for certain. This would not feel like help arriving. It would feel like power arriving. The first crowds, the barefoot pilgrims and desperate families, had been a crisis of hunger and disorder. This new arrival was something else entirely. These were princes, great lords with banners, with reputations, with armored cavalry, and with the kind of confidence that comes from being used to command. From the walls of Constantinople, the approach looked almost like a slow-moving forest. Standards rose above the dust, mail and steel caught the light. Horses, pack animals, wagons, and marching men filled the roads, and with every mile they closed, the emperor's problem sharpened. Alexios had asked the West for soldiers he could integrate into a Byzantine campaign. What he was receiving now was a coalition that did not belong to him. It did not even truly belong to one leader. It was several armies, several ambitions, flowing toward the same gate. Inside the capital, court officials tried to measure it with numbers and logistics, but Alexios measured it with something more useful: intent. He watched how they camped, how they negotiated, how they looked at the city, because he had learned long ago that an army reveals its character before it ever draws a weapon, by how it behaves when it thinks no one is watching. And what Alexios saw was not a single instrument waiting to be picked up. He saw a collection of blades, each with its own hand. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, quiet, disciplined, and already wrapped in the kind of moral reputation that made men follow him. He carried himself like someone who could endure hardship without complaint, a leader who didn't need constant theater to prove his authority. There was Raymond of Toulouse, older, pious, experienced, a man who took the language of devotion seriously, but who also understood power and did not surrender it easily. His camp had the feel of a crusade as a sacred obligation, with clergy close to the center of decision-making. And then there was Bohemond of Toronto, the one who made Alexios' advisors shift uneasily before anyone said a word. Bohemond was Norman, not merely Western, but Norman in the most pointed sense, raised in the world of conquest, shaped by campaigns against Byzantium itself, and brilliant enough to understand Byzantine politics almost as well as any courtier born in the Purple City.
Alexios remembered his name. More importantly, Alexios remembered his bloodline. Bohemond's father, Robert Guiscard, had once threatened Byzantine lands. Bohemond had fought in those wars, and now here he was, arriving under the sign of the cross, calling himself a pilgrim warrior, claiming to come as an ally. Alexios did not reject him. He couldn't. To reject the crusade was to invite chaos or war at his doorstep. So he did what he always did when faced with a dangerous guest. He welcomed and he managed. The emperor's first goal was simple: keep the crusaders from becoming one unified mass inside his orbit. If all the princes gathered and negotiated together, they might dictate terms. So Alexios dealt with them the way an experienced ruler handles rival barons, one at a time. He summoned each leader to his court individually. He offered hospitality, gifts, food, and the glittering theater of Byzantium, mosaics, ceremony, silks, and gold that reminded a visitor where the center of wealth still lived. He flattered where flattery worked. He listened where listening bought time. He gave enough to create obligation, but never enough to create comfort. And then, at the heart of every meeting, he asked for the thing that mattered most: an oath. It wasn't a casual promise. It was a binding commitment in a world where vows, especially vows made in a sacred setting, had weight. Alexios demanded that any territory once belonging to the Byzantine Empire, if recovered during the march east, would be restored to imperial control. In return, he would provide supplies and guides. He would grant passage across the Bosporus. He would treat the Crusaders not as enemies camped at his walls, but as allies moving through his lands. From Alexios' perspective, this was not arrogance, it was necessity. Anatolia had been Byzantine. If Western armies took those cities and then kept them, the empire would not be restored, it would be replaced. From the Crusaders' perspective, the oath felt different depending on who you were. Some saw it as a practical step, an exchange of favors. You get supplies and safe passage. The emperor gets legal claim to recovered towns. Fine, the holy mission continues. Others felt the insult under the courtesy. They had not crossed half the world to become tools of Constantinople. They believed the crusade answered to God first, and perhaps to the Pope, but not to an emperor they barely understood. And among them, Bohemond understood the oath in the most dangerous way, as a mechanism to be used. He was perfectly capable of swearing what was required, accepting what was offered, and keeping his true intentions folded away like a knife inside a sleeve. Alexios knew that too. He didn't need to read Bohemond's mind. He only needed to know the type of man he was dealing with. And Alexios had spent his life dealing with men who smiled while measuring your throat. So he leaned harder on ritual, legality, and the pressure of circumstance. The Crusaders needed food, they needed transport, they needed access to roads and markets, they needed the empire's logistical scaffolding, because without it, the march into Anatolia would begin with starvation and confusion. One by one, the oaths were given. Godfrey, disciplined and pragmatic, accepted the arrangement. He understood that the road east ran through imperial territory, and that a broken relationship with Byzantium at the beginning could doom the entire endeavor. Raymond resisted longer. He did not want to be seen as a man who fought for the emperor. He wanted his vow to be pure, aimed upward, not sideways. But even Raymond eventually bent, if not with enthusiasm, then with the awareness that a crusade without supplies and passage would become a tragedy before it ever reached an enemy wall. Alexios watched each oath like a man tying knots in a rope. He knew the rope could still snap, but every knot increased the chance it would hold. He also knew something else. Even if the princes swore, their armies might not share the same discipline. Western armies were not like the Byzantine military machine of earlier centuries. They were coalitions themselves: knights, footmen, retainers, camp followers, priests, moving under the prestige of a lord rather than under a unified bureaucracy. So Alexios moved quickly. He wanted the Crusaders across the strait and away from Constantinople before frustration, misunderstandings, or a single spark turned this alliance into a siege outside his own walls. The Bosporus crossing was, in its own way, an enormous risk dressed up as routine. You can picture it: ships gathering at the shore, men and horses boarding, supplies stacked, banners furled to keep order, the city's skyline behind them like a warning and a promise. For the Crusaders, crossing into Asia felt like stepping into the first chapter of the story they had been told at Clermont. This was the threshold where words became terrain. For Alexios, it was something colder. It was the moment he released a force he could not fully control into a region he desperately needed to reclaim. He provided guides, he provided supplies, he did the practical work of an emperor who understands that battles are won before the first arrow flies, by water, food, roads, and timing. But he also watched carefully, because he had heard too many stories and he had lived through too many betrayals to trust enthusiasm alone. The Crusaders moved out onto Anatolian soil, and the landscape immediately made its demands. This was not the green, familiar countryside of France or the rolling fields of the Rhine. This was a land that could be harsh, dry, and deceptive. Distances stretched, water sources mattered, local hostility could turn a march into a slow bleed. Still, they marched with the momentum of belief and the steel of experienced warfighters. Unlike the People's Crusade, these armies had discipline, they had leadership, they had men who knew how to hold a line, build a camp, and respond to an attack without dissolving into panic. And that difference mattered, because ahead of them was their first true test, Nicaea. Nicaea was not just a city on the map, it was a symbol carved into stone. Once a Byzantine stronghold, it now served as the seat of Seljuk power in the region. It sat uncomfortably close to Constantinople, like a dagger placed on the table to remind you what was at stake. For Alexios, Nicaea represented a chance to reverse the shame of past decades, to put imperial banners back where they belonged, to restore not only territory, but the idea that Byzantium could still reclaim what it had lost. For the Crusader princes, Nicaea represented the beginning of proof that this was not merely a march, not merely an emotional movement, but a campaign that could take a fortified city and keep moving. And for the Seljuks of Rome, under Kilij Arslan, Nicaea was the line they assumed would hold, especially after the...
In the spring of 1097, the Crusade finally steps onto the ground where belief has to prove it can survive reality. After months of marching, bargaining, and crossing borders, the princes' armies reach the edge of their first true obstacle, Nicaea. From a distance, it doesn't look like a city you simply take. It looks like a statement made of stone. Thick walls running for miles, towers standing at regular intervals, a fortress shaped by centuries of Roman and Byzantine engineering. And behind it, almost like nature itself is collaborating with the defenders, Lake Ascania presses up against the city's side, calm and bright, turning half the siege into a puzzle. To the Crusaders, Nicaea is more than a target. It's the first test that matters. The People's Crusade had already failed here. It had approached with enthusiasm and collapsed under pressure. So now the princes arrive with something else: armor, discipline, and experienced leadership. If they cannot take Nicaea, the rest of the road east becomes a question mark. To Alexios Komnenos, watching nearby with a Byzantine force, Nicaea is something even more personal. It is a city that once belonged to his empire, a key point on the map, dangerously close to Constantinople. If it can be recovered, it's not just a victory, it's the beginning of restoration. But the Crusaders don't arrive as one unified army. They come in waves, each lord with his own contingent, his own camp, his own pride. The siege line forms gradually, like a tightening noose that still has gaps. Bohemond and the Normans take their position. Godfrey's men establish their sector. Raymond arrives with a large force and clergy close at hand. Camps rise across the surrounding land, tents, cooking fires, palisades, horses tethered in long lines. The air fills with smoke, sweat, and the sound of thousands of people settling into the slow grind of siege warfare. And it becomes clear almost immediately, a siege is not a battlefield charge. A siege is time turned into a weapon. The first assaults are rough and impatient. The Crusaders, many of them trained for open combat, try to force an answer with ladders and direct pressure. Men run forward with shields raised, ladders scraping against stone, hoping momentum and courage will do what they have done before in smaller wars. Nicaea refuses them. The walls are too strong, the towers too well placed, the defenders too steady. And most importantly, the city is not truly surrounded. Not yet. Because the lake remains open. As long as boats can move across Lake Ascania, supplies can slip into Nicaea. Grain, water, reinforcements, messages, everything a city needs to hold out longer than the men outside can comfortably endure. To starve the city, the Crusaders would need to control the water, and they don't. Not at first. So days pass, then weeks, and the Crusaders begin to learn the oldest lesson of siege warfare. If you cannot break a wall quickly, you must outlast it. They adapt. They dig trenches, they raise palisades, they divide the siege into sectors and begin to operate more systematically. Each prince takes responsibility for a portion of the line, defending his camp, sending patrols, and trying to keep his men fed and focused. Supplies are always a concern.
A siege doesn't just drain the city inside, it drains the army outside. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of water, every horse that needs feed is part of the battle. In time, they begin building engines, catapults, battering rams, protective screens, wooden machines that look awkward at first but represent a shift from impatience to method. Byzantine engineers attached to Alexios' forces contribute knowledge, tools, and technique. It's cooperation, but it's uneasy cooperation. The Crusaders need Byzantine expertise, the Byzantines need Crusader pressure, yet both sides watch each other closely, aware that today's ally can become tomorrow's rival. Inside Nicaea, the defenders watch all of this from the towers. They see the camps hardening, they hear the constant hammering, they watch the siege line become a permanent landscape. The Crusaders are no longer travelers, they are a force that has decided to stay until the city yields. And yet, the defenders still have hope, because their ruler is not supposed to abandon them. Kilij Arslan, Sultan of the Seljuks of Rome, is not inside Nicaea when the siege begins. He had underestimated the Crusaders, assuming they would be another untrained crowd like the earlier pilgrims. He had been away dealing with other problems, other rivals, other pressures, because his world, too, is full of shifting alliances. But when he realizes what is happening, he moves quickly. He gathers forces and rides back toward his capital, determined to break the siege. For him, this is not merely a military necessity. It's prestige. If Nicaea falls, it's not merely a city lost, it's the idea that Seljuk power has reached the doorstep of Byzantium and can hold it. His cavalry approaches, fast and confident, using the methods the Turks know best: mobility, arrows, pressure on the flanks, disruption rather than a slow grind. The Crusaders meet that pressure in a way the People's Crusade never could. The clash is sharp and chaotic. Dust, horses, shouted commands, arrows streaking in and forcing shields up. Kilij Arslan's cavalry attempts to hit the camps where the Crusaders are vulnerable, especially in the sectors that have not yet been fully reinforced. Bohemon's camp takes the shock early. The Normans brace, shields forward, lines tightening. Then reinforcements arrive, Godfrey's men closing gaps, Raymond's forces pushing in to stabilize the field. When the Crusader heavy cavalry finally commits, it doesn't float through the fight like legend. It hits with weight, with momentum, with the blunt reality of armored horses and disciplined riders pushing a line back. Kilij Arslan is forced to withdraw. It's not that his army disappears or loses all strength, it's that the attempt to break the siege fails. The Crusaders hold, they remain outside Nicaea, and the relief effort does not change that fact. For the Seljuk ruler, it's a blow to reputation. For the Crusaders, it's proof. They are not merely pilgrims with symbols, they are an army that can stand against the kind of opponent Byzantium has been struggling to contain. And for the city inside the walls, it is a grim message: no rescue is coming soon. With the relief attempt turned back, Nicaea's fate shifts toward endurance. The defenders can still feed the city through the lake, but the circle is tightening, and time now works against them in a quieter way. Morale erodes, supplies, even with boats, become harder to guarantee. Every day the siege engines fire, every night the camps grow more organized, the psychological walls begin to crack. And outside the city, the Crusaders feel something else rising: expectation. They have invested days and lives into the siege. Many believe when the city falls, they will finally be rewarded, materially, emotionally, spiritually. In the medieval world, siege victory often meant plunder. It was part of how campaigns paid for themselves. It was also part of how warriors felt their suffering justified. And this is where Alexios' priorities begin to diverge sharply from the Crusaders' hopes. Alexios is nearby, watching from his own position, close enough to influence events, far enough to protect his leverage. He does not want Nicaea destroyed. He doesn't want its streets burned, its storehouses emptied, its population scattered. He wants Nicaea restored as an imperial stronghold, quiet, efficient, with minimal damage. For Alexios, Nicaea isn't a prize, it's a piece of the empire's skeleton. So, while the Crusaders grind forward, building machines and tightening their camps, Alexios watches the lake. Because the lake is still the city's lifeline, and it is also the key to ending the siege without a final uncontrolled rush. You can feel the tension building between these two visions of victory. For the Crusaders, victory means the city yields to their effort and they receive the satisfaction that usually follows such effort. For Alexios, victory means the city returns to Byzantine authority, quietly, efficiently, with minimal damage. And neither side fully trusts the other to honor the version of victory they want. By this point, the siege has become more than a military operation. It's become a test of relationships. The Crusader princes are learning how Byzantium thinks: cautious, procedural, obsessed with control. The Byzantines are learning how the Crusaders think, proud, reward-driven, suspicious of being used. Meanwhile, the walls of Nicaea still stand, the towers still cast shadows across the lake, the defenders still watch, counting days. The Crusaders continue to build, continue to fire, continue to tighten the ring. The lake continues to mock them by allowing supplies to slip through, and Alexios continues to calculate, waiting for the moment when one decisive move can close the last opening. Because the siege of Nicaea has proven something already. The Crusaders are capable. They can fight, they can organize, they can persist. But it has also revealed something else, something more dangerous in the long run. The Crusade is not a single unified machine. It is a coalition of strong wills. And the first major city they face is about to become the first major argument about who truly owns a victory. All of that is hanging in the air now, over the dust and smoke, over the steady water of Lake Escape.
While the Crusaders tightened their ring around Nicaea, Alexios Komnenos watched a different battlefield. From the princes' camps, the siege looked like a matter of grit: trenches, palisades, engines, ladders, and the slow punishment of time. The Crusaders were learning patience the hard way, and with every day they held the line, their confidence grew. Many of them believed the end would be simple. When the city finally yielded, they would go in as victors, take their reward, and march on. But Alexios didn't see Nicaea as a reward, he saw it as a key. Nicaea had been Byzantine. It sat too close to Constantinople to be treated like a foreign trophy. If the city were damaged, emptied, or thrown into chaos, it would be a victory that weakened the empire instead of restoring it. Alexios wasn't fighting for a headline, he was fighting for a functioning stronghold, a city he could hold tomorrow, not a ruin he could mourn. And he also understood the other problem, the one the Crusaders couldn't solve from their side of the shore: Lake Escania. As long as that water remained open, Nicaea could breathe. Boats could slip supplies into the city, even while the land gates were sealed by the Crusader ring. The Crusaders could build engines and batter the walls, and still find the siege stretching longer than they could afford, because the city wasn't truly isolated. The lake was the city's hidden corridor. So Alexios began thinking like a Byzantine emperor thinks when brute force is messy. He began thinking in terms of logistics, leverage, and quiet control. He was camped nearby at Pelicanum, close enough to observe, but not so close that he became dependent on Crusader decisions. From there he received reports about morale in the Crusader camps, about the defenders inside the city, about the movement of boats on the lake, about the friction that was already building between Latin expectations and Byzantine priorities. And then he made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable until you remember who the Byzantines were. He decided to put ships on the lake, not by sailing them into it, by carrying them. It wasn't magic, it wasn't legend. It was planning, carpentry, and sheer labor, the kind of labor that makes history turn without ever looking heroic in the moment. The emperor's men gathered boats and materials. They disassembled hulls. They prepared timbers, fittings, rigging, everything that would be needed on the other side. Then they hauled those pieces overland, across uneven ground, along routes chosen for practicality, not for comfort. You can imagine the scene: oxen straining under harness, wheels biting into dirt, ropes taut in the hands of sweating soldiers, shipwrights calling out instructions, timber creaking, metal clinking, and the constant calculation of weight and balance. Every slope had to be managed, every turn had to be controlled. One broken axle could mean a delay measured in days, and days were the currency of the siege. The work was not glamorous, but it was disciplined. Byzantine discipline wasn't always about bravery in an open field. Often it was about making the impossible feel routine through organization. And when the boats were finally brought to the lakeshore, they were reassembled, plank by plank, pin by pin, rope by rope, under watch, under secrecy, under the steady pressure of time. Then came the moment that changed the siege. The boats slid into Lake Escania. At first, perhaps the mist hid them. Perhaps the defenders on the wall only noticed movement on the water, dark shapes where no shape should be. But as morning light strengthened, the truth became undeniable. Byzantine ships were on the lake. The city's lifeline had become a noose. Inside Nicaea, the meaning of that sight was immediate. It wasn't simply a new threat, it was the end of options. Because once the lake was controlled, Nicaea was no longer a city that could outlast the army outside. It was a city waiting for the moment it would have to choose between surrender and collapse. And this is where Alexios moved from logistics to diplomacy. He did not want the Crusaders to storm the city in a final rush. He did not want a desperate, uncontrolled entry that would tear the city apart. Nicaea was valuable precisely because it was intact, because it could become a Byzantine fortress again, not a burned shell. So Alexios sent envoys to negotiate, quietly, secretly, with terms that offered the defenders a way to yield without total humiliation. He promised safety and restraint in exchange for handing the city over to imperial control. From the Byzantine point of view, it was the cleanest solution imaginable. The city would return to the empire with minimal damage. The garrison would avoid a desperate last stand. The emperor would regain a crucial stronghold and send a message across Anatolia: Byzantine is returning.
But the Crusaders, outside the walls, sweating in the trenches, were living inside a different expectation. They had suffered through the siege. They had dug the earth. They had built the engines. They had repelled sorties and held the line. In their world, effort demanded recognition, and recognition often came in the form of entry, plunder, and public victory. So while Alexios negotiated behind the scenes, the Crusader camps were preparing for a climax. You can picture it: ladders being checked, ropes tightened, shields lifted, priests moving among ranks, commanders giving short orders. Men who had been patient now felt the surge of an ending. The city looked close. Victory seemed within reach. And then one morning, as the Crusaders formed from what they believed would be the final assault, they looked up and saw something that made time freeze for a heartbeat. Byzantine banners flew from the towers. The gates opened, not to them, but to imperial troops. Nicaea had surrendered to Alexios. For the Crusaders, it felt like a theft. Not because they didn't understand the logic, but because they understood it too well. The emperor had outmaneuvered them. He had taken the city with paperwork and ships rather than with a final assault. And he had done it in a way that denied them the emotional release they expected and the material reward they assumed would follow. Anger spread fast in the camps, not always as shouting, not always as open revolt, but as something more dangerous: suspicion. Some of the princes had already mistrusted Byzantine. Bohemond especially did not come to Constantinople with an innocent heart. He had seen Byzantine up close before as an enemy. He knew how Alexios thought. And now he had proof that the emperor was willing to play a different game than the Crusaders expected. Even leaders more inclined towards restraint, Godfrey, Raymond, felt the tension. Their men were not abstract political partners. Their men were hungry, exhausted, and looking at a city they believed they had earned. Alexios had anticipated this reaction. He wasn't blind to Crusader pride, and he wasn't careless with morale. So he moved quickly to soften a blow. He distributed supplies. He offered gifts. He allowed limited entry in controlled groups, preventing disorder while giving the princes a way to save face. He treated the Crusaders with formal respect, reminding them that oaths had been sworn and the campaign was not finished. In other words, he tried to buy back trust with the only currencies he had: gold, logistics, and ceremony. And for the moment, it worked. Barely. The Crusaders swallowed the insult, because they still needed to move east, and because the siege of Nicaea was only the beginning. There were greater cities ahead, greater hardships, greater victories and disasters waiting on the road. But something had changed. A fracture had appeared in the Mayas. Nicaea was a victory. No one could deny that. It proved the Crusaders could take on a fortified city. It proved the Seljuks were not dealing with a disorganized crown anymore. It restored a strategic point to the Byzantine Empire. Yet it also proved something else, something that would haunt the Crusade. Byzantine and the Crusader princes did not mean the same thing when they said success. For Alexios, success meant restoration, order, control, a recovered city that could be defended and governed. For the Crusaders, success meant triumph, public recognition, reward, and the feeling that the journey's suffering was repaid in full. Those definitions could overlap for a while, but they were not identical. And once two allies began to measure victory by different standards, every future disagreement becomes easier to ignite. So when the Crusader armies marched away from Nicaea, they carried more than supplies and renewed confidence. They carried a new suspicion. And Alexios, standing with his recovered city, carried something else: a restored stronghold, yes, but also the uneasy awareness that the force he had called from the west could not be commanded like an imperial regiment. He had tightened the net around Nicaea and won the city with minimal damage. But the cost was written into the faces of the men leaving his camp. The road east would continue, and the tension born here, between imperial strategy and Crusader expectation, would travel with them, like a shadow that lengthens the farther you walk into the sun.
Morning breaks over Nicaea with the strange calm that comes right before a finale. The air is cool at first, then quickly turns sharp and bright as the sun climbs. Outside the walls, the Crusader camps are already awake. Men tightening straps, lifting shields, checking ladders, moving with the quiet focus of people who believe the ending is finally in reach. For weeks they have lived in dust and smoke and routine. They have dug, built, waited, and endured. They have watched the city's towers day after day, measuring progress in small signs. A weaker reply from the battlements, fewer boats on the lake, longer silences at night. Now, on this morning, the feeling in the camp is unmistakable. They think it's time. They form up as if the city will fall to one final push. Captains murmur short orders. Priests move along the lines. The whole siege ring seems to hold its breath. And then a ripple runs through the ranks, quiet at first, like a rumor trying to decide if it dares to be true. Someone points upward. On the towers of Nicaea, where the Crusaders expected to see the enemy's colors, a different banner is rising. It catches the wind, snaps once, and settles into its full shape. Imperial purple, Byzantine insignia, the kind of flag that doesn't merely mark ownership, it declares authority. For a heartbeat, the Crusader line doesn't move at all. The moment feels too unnatural, like the world has skipped a step. Then the second shock hits. The gates open. Not for them. Byzantine troops appear in ordered formation, moving with the measured discipline of an army that expects to take possession, not to rush for victory. Spears upright, helmets steady, no frenzy, no collapse into chaos, just a controlled entry and a controlled occupation. And in that instant, everyone outside the walls understands what has happened, even if no one wants to say it out loud. Nicaea has surrendered, to Emperor Alexios. To the Crusaders, it feels like the ground shifts under their feet. They have suffered for this siege, they have invested their strength,
They have told themselves a story in which the climax would belong to them, because in their world, a siege is paid for in effort, and effort is rewarded with entry, with recognition, with the visible proof that hardship was not wasted. But the city is now being claimed by the man who did not stand in their trenches. Alexios Komnenos, watching all of this from close enough to control it, has done exactly what a Byzantine emperor is trained to do. He has taken the result he needed while avoiding the kind of ending he feared. Because Alexios never wanted a last rush into Nicaea. He didn't want the city stripped, burned, or shattered by the chaos that often follows a fortress falling to an army hungry for release. Nicaea wasn't a distant prize for him. It was a hinge city, a strategic lock on the road to Constantinople, a place the empire needed not as ruins but as a working fortress again, walls standing, storehouses intact, the population not scattered to the wind. So he used the lake. He closed the city's last breath of supply, then offered terms behind the scenes, terms that gave the defenders a path to surrender without being pushed into desperation. And when the moment came, he moved quickly, before the Crusaders could force an ending that would make the city useless to him. In Byzantine logic, it's brilliant. In Crusader emotion, it feels like betrayal. You can see it on their faces before you hear it in their voices. Men lower ladders that were meant to meet the wall. A horn bearer, ready to signal the final assault, hesitates and then slowly lowers the horn as if it suddenly weighs too much. Captains turn to one another, searching for an explanation that doesn't make their sacrifice feel stolen. And soon the murmurs turn into a harder sound. Anger doesn't always arrive as shouting. Sometimes it arrives as suspicion, quiet, spreading, and far more dangerous. A question forms in thousands of minds at once. If the emperor can take Nicaea like this, what else will he take? What else will he deny? What is he really doing with us? Among the leaders, the reactions are different shades of the same wound. Godfrey of Bouillon, disciplined and careful, keeps his line from breaking into disorder. He understands that chaos outside the city helps no one, but even in restraint there is tension. He has to contain not only men, but disappointment. Raymond of Toulouse, a man who wrapped his mission in devotion, feels the insult in a different way. He did not come east to serve an emperor's plan. He came east for God. Yet he also knows that pride alone cannot feed an army. His expression hardens, not into rage, but into something colder, a reminder that this alliance has limits. And Bohemond of Taranto, Norman, ambitious and experienced in the ways Byzantine plays its games, does not need anyone to explain what happened. He has seen this style of victory before. A win achieved by maneuver, not by spectacle. A win that keeps the other side dependent. A win that makes you feel like an ally and a pawn at the same time. If there is a man in the Crusader camp who will remember Nicaea like a debt, it is Bohemond. Alexios anticipates the backlash. He is not careless. He knows that an insult to Crusader expectations can turn into a fracture that ruins the entire campaign. So he moves immediately to soften the blow, using the tools he trusts most: logistics, gifts, and controlled access. Gold is brought out, supplies are distributed, food, coin, and equipment, enough to remind the Crusader leaders that the emperor is still a necessary partner on this road, enough to keep the men from feeling completely robbed, even if they still feel cheated of the kind of victory they imagined. Alexios also allows limited entry into the city, but not the kind of entry the Crusaders wanted. Small groups, supervised under Byzantine control. No free-for-all, no uncontrolled claim to the streets, no reward that could turn Nicaea into a gutted shell. To many Crusaders, this controlled entry is almost worse than being denied outright, because it confirms the truth. The emperor is not trusting them, and he is not sharing power. He is managing them. And yet, despite all of this, the crusade doesn't collapse here. Not because the Crusaders are suddenly satisfied, but because the road ahead is still long and the stakes are still larger than one city. They have come too far, they have spent too much, and they still believe Jerusalem waits at the end of the story. So the leaders swallow their anger, at least for now. They accept the supplies. They accept the fact that Nicaea, the first great prize, has been claimed in the name of Byzantine. They tell themselves there will be other victories, bigger ones no emperor can take away with a treaty and a flag. But something has changed in the air between East and West. Before Nicaea, the Crusaders might have believed the emperor was a partner with a shared goal. After Nicaea, many begin to see him as a ruler with a separate agenda, one that runs parallel to theirs but does not truly merge with it. And Alexios, for his part, sees something too. He sees that the Crusaders are not a single obedient tool. They are proud, competitive, and driven by a mixture of devotion and ambition. They can be directed, negotiated with, even influenced, but not controlled like Byzantine troops. That realization will matter later when bigger cities fall and harder decisions must be made. For now, Alexios has what he wanted most. Nicaea is intact, restored to imperial authority, a crucial stronghold returned to the empire's defensive line. It is a victory of preservation rather than destruction, a victory that keeps the city useful. For the Crusaders, Nicaea is still a victory, but it is a victory with a bitter aftertaste. They proved they could take a fortified city. They proved they could stand against Seljuk relief forces. They proved they were not the helpless crowd that died in Anatolia the year before. Yet they also learned, painfully, that victory does not automatically mean ownership. As the days pass, the camps begin to change again. Tents come down, wagons are loaded, fires are doused. The great host turns its attention eastward, because the crusade is not a siege meant to end at Nicaea. Nicaea was only the gate. Columns form, banners rise. The road stretches ahead into the Anatolian interior. Hard country, uncertain water, ambushed terrain, and cities with names that already sound like legend. Antioch, then Jerusalem. As the Crusaders begin to march away, some men glance back at the towers of Nicaea, still flying Byzantine flags. That image stays with them, not as a memory of triumph, but as a warning. It says allies can compete, partners can maneuver, And even when you share a cause, you may not share the same definition of success. Behind them, Alexios stands with a recovered city and an alliance that is already starting to strain. Ahead of them, the Crusaders carry their faith, their steel, and now something new: suspicion. Nicaea has fallen, and the Crusade has truly begun. But so has the conflict beneath the Crusade, the quiet struggle of who will shape the outcome of this journey: an emperor fighting for restoration, or princes marching for salvation, glory, and a future they intend to claim with their own hands.